Hi everyone. Sorry it's been a while. Welcome back to another episode of The Cochrane Doctrine with me, Eric Cochrane. Please like and subscribe to my channel down below. So, in my past two vlogs, I started touching on political topics, beginning with immigration. It's May 2021 now, and as we all know, it's been a very polarizing, racially charged last 12 months. In this time frame, I've certainly discovered Candace Owens, as well as seen Larry Elder's documentary Uncle Tom, which I found very interesting, which Candace was featured in. Both have inspired me to read Booker T. Washington's autobiography, Up From Slavery, which I did this past February. I have also just completed reading Candace's book, Blackout. So, my next several vlogs going forward will be regarding issues about race and our country's past. So, I'm going to dedicate this first vlog to discussing outright historical ignorance about slavery. Spending much time on YouTube watching intellectual videos by famed African-American economist Thomas Sowell, who I think is one of the greatest in his field. I credit with a lot of these facts that I'm going to share. But as far back as 5th grade, I was well aware of much of what I'm going to say, starting off. So, nobody who has so little as a high school diploma should be so simple-minded to not know that slavery has been practiced since ancient times on every continent by people of all races and ethnicities. The two greatest monuments of the ancient world still standing today, the pyramids at Gaza in Egypt and the Great Wall of China, were largely built by slaves. Enslaving criminals and people who were conquered dates back to the earliest of civilizations. The Persians enslaved just about everybody whom they conquered. Slavery was intertwined with the Roman Empire. Many structures built by slaves, not to mention the gladiators, being slaves who were forced to battle animals as well as each other in the arenas, most notably the Colosseum, for entertainment. Perhaps the most famous of the Roman gladiators being Spartacus. Into the Middle Ages it continued. For those of you who don't know, the word slave is derived of the word Slav, who made up much of the people who were enslaved all over Europe for close to a millennia. At the same time, slavery continued around the world, with the Mongols in Asia enslaving other Asians, Africans enslaving other Africans, and the Islamic world enslaving many of their own, and even indigenous people here in the Americas enslaving other indigenous people, if you can believe that. For anybody who continues to call our country stolen ground, be aware that before the Europeans arrived in the Western Hemisphere at the end of the 15th century, indigenous Americans battled, enslaved, sacrificed, and even cannibalized each other for centuries. This idea that they peacefully sat around campfires, smoked their pipes, and coexisted amongst each other could not be further from the truth. In less than a half century after Columbus arrived, the two most powerful empires, the Aztecs and the Incas in the Americas, were toppled in a matter of years. The Spanish alone could not have done it without the many indigenous allies they had who turned against their Aztec and Incan superiors. Within a century, it was disease, neither warfare nor enslavement, that had killed off most natives the Spanish came in contact with. It was at this point significant numbers of slaves were imported from Africa over the course of the next 3 centuries. In the 3-century-long Atlantic slave trade, slaves were being imported to the Americas from Africa from every developed European nation who had colonies here in the Americas. That includes the English, the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and more than any other, the Portuguese. All of these people imported slaves to the Americas from Africa. Somewhere between 2/3 to 3/4 of the slaves they loaded up on ships in Western Africa were already enslaved back in Africa. If you have ever traveled so much out of this country to the Caribbean, you notice how much of the islands are inhabited by black and mulatto residents. Clearly, you can see the racial legacy of slavery. The number one cash crop that African slaves were imported to grow here in the Americas that brought more wealth than any other was sugarcane. Sugarcane was never grown here in the U.S., but in the Caribbean, and more so Brazil. It was in fact Brazil where the Atlantic slave trade lasted the longest, from 1516 to 1888. In those over 3.5 centuries, almost 5 million slaves had been imported. On the contrary, the U.S. had just under 4 million slaves at its peak when the Civil War broke out, and had stopped importing slaves from Africa effective 1808. Practically no slave who lived through the Civil War had been born in Africa, but were now nearly all descendants of those who had. It sounds hard to believe, but those in power in East Africa as far back as the 8th century had been trading their slaves to the merchants of the Middle East. All through the Middle Ages, the Islamic world was the most advanced, wealthiest region on the globe. Much of the Silk Road stretched through Arabia, Iraq, and Persia. Arabs were also the best sailors at the time. The reason we don't see the legacy of African slavery in the Middle East so much today is because females were far more desirable to the Arab world for the sake of being kept in harems. Men were made into eunuchs, as in castrated, to keep them from reproducing, and put to work guarding the harems. This lasted well into the era of the end of the Ottoman Empire. Today, 1/3 of practicing Muslims here in the U.S. are African Americans by birth. Whether they are converts or born of those from only a few generations back, the Nation of Islam has largely inspired that. The Nation of Islam began as a movement of African Americans shedding Christianity as what they saw as the Anglo-Saxon religion, seemingly oblivious of the reality that the Islamic world had been importing slaves from Africa for centuries. It's so easy today to look at our country's past wrongdoing, yet people aren't willing to acknowledge that it was in fact the developed European powers, as well as here in the U.S., that were among the first in the world to acknowledge the wrongs of slavery. We are among the first to abolish it, and in the U.S., we're willing to fight and die to end it. The Civil War was, of course, the bloodiest conflict in our nation's history. The same goes for acknowledging women as equals in society. It's hard because it doesn't seem like it was that long ago, but compare it to much of the Islamic world. Many continue to cite our country's racist past, beginning with the 3/5 compromise within the Constitution. There is a huge misunderstanding as to why it was written, and many fail to realize that it was advocated by the northern states who even then were opposing slavery and weary of its future. In 1790, the northern states had a population of 1.8 million to the South's 1.1 million whites and 633,000 slaves. Over 1/3 of the South's population was slaves, making population almost equal between the slave and free states. Considering how population plays into the role of representatives, if slaves were counted, not as 3/5 but 1, think of how much more powerful white representatives of slave states would have been at the federal level without slave representation in government. In reality, the 3/5 compromise gave the northern states an edge in representation and kept the slave states weaker. Fast forward to 70 years later, when the Civil War broke out. One of the biggest advantages the North had in the Civil War was population. 21 million in the North versus 9 million in the Confederacy, about 3.5 million of whom were slaves. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise, think of how much more powerful slaves would have been in terms of federal representation. Without the Three-Fifths Compromise, the Constitution would have never been framed, and there would have been two nations, one free and one slave, from the start. During the antebellum era, less than half of Southern households owned any slaves at all. As for the less than half which did, no more than a dozen was all most could afford. The Southerners who owned huge plantations, worked by dozens to hundreds of slaves, constituted the wealthiest less than 10% of Southern households. There were, at the very most, 2.5 million Southern white slave owners, whether they owned one or a few hundred slaves, in a nation of 30 million in 1861. In other words, that means that less than 10% of the nation's 26.5 million white residents owned any slaves. If we want to talk about how much of a joke reparations would be, I dedicated my previous two vlogs to immigration. Over 30 million European immigrants came here in the half-century following the Civil War. Just for starters, when the Civil War began, the Union population outnumbered the Confederacy's white population almost 4-1. But regardless of that, at this point, on the subject of race and ethnicity, no fewer than half of white Americans are made up of partial to exclusive heritage that came here after the Civil War. I certainly am, being Czech and Lithuanian on my mother's side. To go along with that, if you have any Italian, any Polish, Croatian, Jewish, Greek, or Armenian heritage, they postdate the Civil War too. Not very many white Americans today have major ties to slavery. And so far, the two highest black, technically mulatto, politicians we've had have no ancestors who were slaves in this country. Barack Obama was born to a Kenyan father and white American mother, raised exclusively by his maternal side. Kamala Harris is a second-generation American born to a Jamaican father and Indian mother. Why should either of them have a say in the matter of reparations? Who should pay? Who gets what? It's a joke, and it's stupid political rhetoric. I'm Eric Cochran. Thanks for watching.